If you're a Panther enthusiast, brace yourself, because the reality behind this iconic German tank is far more complicated than the stories glorifying its deadly gun and sleek design. This isn't about being harsh or disrespectful, but many of the truths about the Panther are conveniently left out. Today, we're diving into the real story behind Germany's fabled cat of World War II. The Panther was conceived as Germany's next-generation medium tank, intended to replace the Panzer IV. But by the time it rolled off the production line, it weighed in the league of heavy tanks, nearly 45 tons, almost double what its running gear and mechanical systems were originally designed for. German engineers themselves even considered tanks like the Soviet IS-2 super heavy, despite its weight being roughly comparable. And yes, the Panther featured advanced technology for its time. But how practical and reliable that technology was, that's the question often overlooked. The origins of the Panther predate the war. German planners had already begun searching for a successor to the Panzer III and I-4, envisioning a nimble 20-ton design that became the VK-20 series. Out of that concept, the Panther emerged, but here lies the first enduring problem. Systems built for 24 tons were now expected to carry nearly twice that. Predictably, engines and transmissions faced immense strain from the very beginning. Then came the summer of 1941. German troops were suddenly confronted with the Soviet T-34 and KV-1, tanks far more resilient than the lightweight BT series they had been annihilating during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. Anti-tank guns that had seemed invincible suddenly failed. Alarmed, the Wehrmacht dispatched a Panzer Commission to inspect these formidable new adversaries. Their conclusion was clear. German tanks needed stronger armour, heavier guns, and greater tactical mobility. Many claimed the Panther was a knee-jerk reaction to the T-34. In reality, work had already begun before the Tiger was even designed. Yet, the sudden shock of Soviet armour accelerated development. Unlike the Tiger, conceived as a heavy breakthrough tank bristling with armour on every side, the Panther was intended to slot into regular panzer companies, say a mobile, hard-hitting replacement for the ageing Panzer IV. The design team at Munich made bold and unconventional choices. They opted for torsion bar suspension and a rear-mounted petrol engine, but the drive sprockets were at the front, forcing a long drive shaft to snake beneath the turret. This clever yet complex solution increased the tank's profile and created headaches for every mechanic who had to maintain it. Its sloped armour echoed the design of the T-34, a nod to battlefield lessons learned from the Eastern Front. And rather than building the hull in separate upper and lower sections, the Panther used interlocking joints to create a single solid structure, stronger and more resilient, but far more difficult to produce. And here we reach the first compromise that at first glance might seem minor, but it was anything but. Consider this. For every 5 Panthers Germany produced, they could have built 6 upgraded Panzer IVs, each armed with the long-barreled 75mm gun that proved lethal against almost every Allied tank during the war. On paper, it doesn't seem drastic, but in reality, it meant around 1,000 fewer tanks on the battlefield, and the Panthers they did produce were far from reliable. From blueprint to first prototype, the Panther was pushed through in under a year. On the surface, that sounds like an engineering triumph. In truth, it was a recipe for disaster. Hitler insisted the Panther be combat ready for the Battle of Kursk at any cost. Testing. There was almost none. The tank went directly from the drawing board into mass production, with its flaws waiting to be revealed on the battlefield instead of in controlled trials. The first signs of trouble emerged even before the Panther reached the front. 2 tanks ignited while being unloaded from trains prior to Operation Citadel in July 1943, and several more went up in flames en route to the front lines. How could such an advanced machine catch fire so easily? The answer lies in its Maybach engine. Occasionally, the fuel mixture failed to combust completely, sending unburned gasoline into the searing exhaust system. Once ignited, flames could leap into the wiring and engine compartment, a nightmare in a cramped tank carrying ammunition, fuel, and 5 crew members, particularly on the frigid Russian steppe. At night, early Panthers literally spat fire from their exhausts, making them glowing targets for artillery. Flame-suppressing mufflers eventually solved the problem, but by Kursk, the issue was still very real. Of the first 200 Panther D models deployed, fewer than half were operational within 2 days, not destroyed by Soviet fire, but crippled by their own mechanical failures. Once on the battlefield, misfortune compounded. Panthers bogged down in anti-tank ditches filled with water, rolled into expertly prepared minefields, and fell victim to artillery barrages. Green crews, unfamiliar with the tank's quirks, often became trapped before even firing a shot. On day 1, 18 Panthers were lost. On day 2, another 37 went down, including a tragic case of friendly fire when a Panzer IV mistook a Panther for a Soviet tank, destroying it and killing the entire crew. There was a glimmer of effectiveness amid the chaos, their first true tank versus tank engagement. Facing the American-built M3 Lees supplied to the Red Army through Lend-Lease, the Panthers destroyed 6 of them. Yet even here the irony was sharp. The M3 Lee was far from a formidable opponent by this stage of the war. By the close of Kursk, over 200 Panthers had been knocked out of action. Astonishingly, roughly 130 of these losses weren't caused by Soviet shells or artillery. They were victims of mechanical failure. The untested, fragile tank itself was only part of the problem. The crews were another. Hastily assembled from Panzer IV units, many received only a crash course, sometimes just a few hours to familiarize themselves with a machine they barely understood, before being thrust into combat. Secrecy around the Panther program made matters worse. Early crews weren't allowed to take notes or photos, so every detail had to be memorized. By the end of 1943, the Panther had started to demonstrate its potential. It was credited with destroying around 500 T-34s at the cost of roughly 100 Panthers. Impressive on paper, yet breakdowns still sidelined more tanks than enemy fire ever did. Engineers worked tirelessly to patch and refine the design, culminating in the final G model, which represented about half of all Panthers ever produced. But even with improvements, the fundamental flaw remained. A 45-ton vehicle built on a chassis originally designed for 25 tons could never truly be reliable. Armour was another battlefield headache. Up front, the Panther carried 80 mm of rolled homogeneous steel, sloped at 55 deg, giving an effective thickness of roughly 100 to 130 mm, formidable by 1943 standards. Early D models used face-hardened plates, later replaced with fully tempered steel. The sides were thinner, just 40 mm at a 50 degrees slope, later increased to 50 mm on the G model. Yet the rear deck was a glaring vulnerability, at a mere 16 mm, leaving it exposed to artillery airbursts. Weak points lingered around hatches, ventilators, and louvers, no matter the improvements. The original rounded gun mantlet also proved dangerous. Incoming rounds could ricochet downwards into the thin 17 mm upper hull, threatening the driver and radio operator, a flaw known as the shot trap. This was later corrected with a redesigned mantlet that deflected rounds away instead of down. Another persistent issue was the gap between the sponsons and tracks, which left the sides vulnerable to Soviet 14.5 mm anti-tank rifles. Side skirts offered a partial solution, tumbling incoming rounds before they could strike the main armour. A fix later applied to other German tanks as well. Interestingly, German engineers even began work on a follow-up design, sometimes called the Panther II, intended to share parts with the Tiger II. Only a single hull was completed before the project was abandoned. Finally, the Panther's suspension was a matter of debate among crews. A feature that could be either loved or despised, depending on the terrain, the mission, and often sheer luck. The Panther's overlapping road wheels were a marvel of engineering, distributing weight with precision and giving the tank exceptional cross-country mobility. Yet this brilliance came with a cost. Mud and ice could wedge themselves between the wheels, and when winter nights froze the terrain, the entire running gear could lock solid. Soviet commanders quickly learned to exploit this, launching early morning assaults, knowing that German tanks, Panthers and Tigers alike, were often immobile at the worst possible moment. When the suspension did work, however, it was extraordinary. It could absorb irregular terrain up to half a metre deep, a capability unmatched until the Leopard would appear decades later. But that sophistication brought a relentless need for maintenance, constant repairs, and a ticking clock on reliability. Even the Soviets, fascinated by captured Panthers, ran exhaustive tests and put some into combat, only to discover the same vulnerabilities. Parts were perpetually scarce. The cooling system struggled under heavy strain, and the engines were prone to overheating during high-rev operations. The Achilles heel of the Panther, though, was the final drive. Early models could only last about 150 kilometers before failing, while the engine itself might survive 1,000. By May 1944, German records suggested some improvement. Panther crews could manage between 1,900 to 2,000 kilometers before an overhaul, roughly on par with the Panzer IV. But as the war dragged into 1945, declining production quality and inexperienced crews made mechanical failure an ever-present threat. Yet the Panther's gun was its salvation. The 75mm WK-42 L-70 was among the finest tank weapons of the Second World War. Its 5-metre barrel fired armour-piercing rounds at 9 to 35 metres per second, capable of punching through 112mm of armour at a kilometre's distance. With scarce tungsten rounds, velocity soared to 1,130 meters, and penetration reached to 150 meters at a 30-degree angle, enough to pierce virtually any Allied tank from over a mile away. The rate of fire hovered around 6 rounds per minute, and some variants carried 50 shells in a single side sponson, a potential disaster if that vulnerable compartment were struck. The Panther even pioneered night fighting technology. The FG-1250 system paired an infrared spotlight with a gunner's scope, allowing nighttime engagements on the Eastern Front in late 1944. Western allies, equipped with detectors that could sense its emissions, often stripped these kits before deployment. Germany wasn't alone in this experimentation. Americans tested infrared on Shermans as early as 1942, and the Soviets ran night-driving trials, yet neither entered combat. Even during the Korean War, active infrared remained largely experimental, and it wouldn't become standard until the 1960s. The Panther's true dominance arrived in the summer of 1944, when veteran crews still manned the tanks. Afterward, attrition slowly wore down experience, and new recruits struggled to handle a machine that demanded both skill and precision. The Panther, for all its power, was only as formidable as the men who drove it. Many Panther crews were green, dangerously green. Some had little to no live-fire experience, and a shocking number hadn't even completed a proper driver's course. Tanks rolled into combat, without the crew ever firing a single round in training. Unsurprisingly, these inexperienced operators often hastened mechanical failures, mismanaging gearboxes, overstressing engines, and creating breakdowns before the enemy could even aim. When the Panther was operational, though, it could dominate. On the Eastern Front, it terrorized Soviet armor, and German forces even repurposed Panther turrets as static fortifications. Encased in reinforced concrete along the Siegfried Line and Atlantic defences, these stationary guns became nightmares for attacking infantry, nearly impervious to conventional attacks. Normandy posed a very different challenge. Roughly 400 Panthers were deployed, but the bocage terrain was a killer. Their long 75mm guns struggled to swing in the narrow hedgerows, and mobility was severely limited. When a line of fire opened, they wreaked havoc on Shermans and Churchills. But the close quarters often allowed Allied forces to flank them at frighteningly short ranges. British Sherman Fireflies, armed with the deadly 17-pounder, could punch through a Panther's frontal armour, making the fight a deadly race of who could spot and shoot first. One of the more bizarre Panther episodes occurred during the Battle of the Bulge. German crews attempted a ruse. 5 Panthers were disguised as American M10 tank destroyers, complete with false armour plates and US markings. For a moment, it almost fooled the Allies, but deception has limits. Suspicion arose, the disguise was exposed, and all 5 Panthers were destroyed. Paint could not save them. After the war, France pressed about 50 captured Panthers into service from 1946 to 1950. They managed to resolve the notorious engine fire issues, and crews praised the gun and optics. Yet without a reliable supply of German spare parts and complete technical understanding, keeping them operational was a constant struggle. Mechanical failures plagued them, and within a few years the French retired the Panther entirely. Historians remain split on the Panther's legacy. Some hail it as the finest German tank of the war, well conceived, balanced, and formidable in design. Others are more sceptical, acknowledging its impressive specifications while highlighting the long catalogue of flaws that undermined its effectiveness. A final group dismisses it outright, arguing that despite its firepower and armour, it never fulfilled its intended role in 1943 and never truly recovered. So, was the Panther a brilliant weapon or an overhyped headache? The answer depends on who you ask and how many broken transmissions they've had to study.